This photo of two friends seemed innocent until historians noticed a dark secret. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. received donations almost daily. Boxes of family photographs, documents, artifacts that people hoped would contribute to the preservation of Black history. James Rivera had worked as a curator there for 5 years, and he had seen thousands of images pass through his hands, daguerreotypes of freed men, portraits of civil rights activists, snapshots of everyday life across generations. But on a humid September morning in 2024, he opened a box that made him stop and stare. The donation had come from an estate sale in Richmond, Virginia. The accompanying letter explained that the items had belonged to an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, who had passed away at 97 with no living relatives. Her home had been filled with historical documents and photographs, carefully preserved, but never explained. The estate executive thought the museum might find something of value. James lifted out a leather portfolio and opened it carefully. Inside, protected by layers of tissue paper, was a studio photograph mounted on thick cardboard. The photographer's mark read, Anderson & Sons Photography, Richmond, Virginia, 1889. Two young men stood side by side in the photograph, both wearing identical dark suits with high-colored white shirts and patterned ties. They were positioned in front of a painted backdrop showing a library with books lining the walls. A small table beside them held a vase of flowers and what appeared to be a Bible. The young man on the left was white, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, with light hair neatly parted and a handlebar mustache just beginning to fill in. His expression was serious but warm, his eyes looking directly at the camera with confidence. The young man on the right was black, roughly the same age, with a strong jaw and intelligent eyes. His posture was equally upright, his clothing identical in quality and style to his companions. Most striking was the positioning. The white man's hand rested on the black man's shoulder, and the black man's hand reached across to grip his companion's forearm. It was an unmistakable gesture of friendship, of brotherhood, even for a photograph taken in 1889 Virginia, just 24 years after the end of the Civil War, in a time when Jim Crow laws were solidifying racial segregation across the South. This image was extraordinary. Interracial friendship existed certainly, but it was rarely documented so formally, so publicly. Studio portraits were expensive, deliberate affairs. People didn't commission them casually. James pulled out his magnifying glass and examined the photograph more closely. That was when he began to notice the details that didn't fit the narrative of simple friendship. The white man's hand on his companion's shoulder. James looked closer and saw that the fingers weren't resting gently, but gripping tightly, the knuckles slightly white from pressure. The black man's smile, which had seemed genuine at first glance, didn't quite reach his eyes. In his free hand, the one not gripping his friend's arm was clenched into a fist at his side. James moved his magnifying glass across the background of the photograph. The painted backdrop showed a refined library, but in the lower right corner, partially obscured by the small table, something hung on the wall. He adjusted his desk lamp and leaned closer. It was a chain, heavy links painted into the backdrop in Congress with the elegant library setting. Why would a photography studio include a chain in a backdrop meant to suggest education and refinement? James turned the photograph over. The back of the mounting board was yellowed with age, but someone had written across it in faded brown ink. The handwriting was shaky, as if written quickly or under emotional duress. Thomas and Marcus, the last photograph before the departure. May God forgive us for what we have done. September 14th, 1889. James read the inscription 3 times. Last photograph before the departure. Were they going somewhere together? Separating? And that phrase, may God forgive us for what we have done. Not what we must do or what we will do, but what we have done. Something had already happened when this photograph was taken, something that required divine forgiveness. He photographed the image from multiple angles, capturing every detail in high resolution. Then, clear as throat, he opened his laptop and began to search. He needed to find out who Thomas and Marcus were, why they had posed for this photograph together in 1889 Virginia, and what dark secret was hidden in the tension beneath their posed friendship. The investigation had begun, and James had a feeling this photograph would reveal a story far more complex and painful than the simple portrait of friendship it appeared to be at first glance. James spent the rest of that day searching for any record of Thomas and Marcus from 1889, Richmond. Without last names, the search was difficult. Both names were common in that period. He started with the photographer's mark, Anderson & Sons Photography. Richmond city directories from the 1880s showed that Anderson & Sons had operated a studio on Broad Street from 1885 to 1893, advertising themselves as specialists in fine portraiture for distinguished families. The emphasis on distinguished families suggested they catered to Richmond's white elite, making the photograph of an interracial pair even more unusual. James examined the photograph again, under different lighting conditions, looking for any other clues he might have missed. The suits both men wore expensive, tailored, not ready-made. The fabric appeared to be fine wool, appropriate for a formal portrait. Their shoes, visible at the bottom of the frame, were polished leather. Everything about their presentation suggested wealth and status, but something about the black man's posture nagged at James. Despite the expensive clothing and the confident stance, there was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a guardedness in his expression that spoke of someone who had learned to be careful, to watch and wait. James had seen similar expressions in photographs of freed men from the Reconstruction era, people who had gained legal freedom but still navigated a world designed to constrain them. He decided to approach the search differently. If these were distinguished families, there might be records in Richmond's historical archives, property records, court documents, newspaper mentions. He contacted his colleague, Dr. Patricia Okoye, who taught African American history at Howard University and had extensive connections with archives throughout Virginia. Patricia called him back within 2 hours. "I'm intrigued," she said. "Can you send me high-resolution scans of the photograph? I want to look at it myself." James emailed her the images, and they arranged to meet the following day at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, where Patricia had already scheduled time to search through property, records and newspaper archives from the 1880s and 1890s. That evening, James couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. He had handled thousands of historical images, but something about this one felt different. The inscription, "May God forgive us," suggested guilt, complicity, perhaps even crime. He had that chain in the background, partially hidden, but unmistakably there. Had the photographer included it deliberately, or had it been part of the studio's standard backdrop, a detail that took on sinister meaning only in the context of who was being photographed? He pulled up census records from 1890, searching for any Thomas and Marcus listed in the same household in Richmond or the surrounding counties. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed by fire, but fragments remained. After 2 hours of searching, he found an entry that made his pulse quicken. In Henriot County, just outside Richmond, the 1880 census listed a Thomas Whitmore, aged 13, living with his parents, William and Elizabeth Whitmore. William's occupation was listed as planter, the term used for large-scale farmers, often former plantation owners. The household included several people listed as servants, and among them was a boy named Marcus, age 13, with no last name given. His race was marked as colored. James sat back, his mind racing. In 1880, 15 years after the end of slavery, census records still often listed black workers without full names or with only first names, a holdover from slavery when enslaved people had no legal surnames. If this was the same Marcus from the photograph, he would have been around 22 or 23 in 1889, matching the apparent age of the man in the portrait. And Thomas Whitmore would have been the same age, having grown up in the same household as Marcus. James searched for more information about the Whitmore family. William Whitmore appeared in multiple records, property deeds, tax records, mentions in Richmond newspapers related to agricultural associations. The family had owned a substantial plantation called Oakwood, about 15 miles outside Richmond, before the war. After the war, they had retained the property, though the record showed it had been reduced in size. What had happened to Marcus? Had he remained with the Whitmore family after emancipation, and if so, under what circumstances? The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in 1865, but James knew that many formerly enslaved people had remained with their former owners, bound by economic necessity, exploitative labor contracts, or outright intimidation. He needed to see the property records, labor contracts, and any legal documents related to the Whitmore family. He needed to understand the relationship between Thomas and Marcus, whether they had genuinely been friends, as the photograph suggested, or whether something darker lay beneath the surface of their posed companionship. James looked at the photograph one more time before closing his laptop. Two young men dressed identically, hands on each other in gestures of connection. But the tension in Marcus's fist, the too tight grip of Thomas's hand, the chain in the background, all of it whispered of a story that was far from simple friendship. Tomorrow in Richmond, he would begin to uncover the truth. The Library of Virginia occupied a modern building near Capitol Square in Richmond. Its collections, preserving centuries of the state's history, including the uncomfortable truths of slavery, Jim Crow, and racial violence. James met Patricia in the research room early Wednesday morning, and they requested records for Henry County from 1860 through 1900, focusing on property deeds, court documents, and labor contracts. The archivist brought them boxes of documents, and they divided the work. Patricia took the property records, while James focused on court files and legal contracts. Within an hour, Patricia found the Whitmore family's property history. The plantation was called Oakwood, she said, spreading out a surveyor's map from 1858. On 200 acres. William Whitmore inherited it from his father in 1867, right after the war. The 1860 slave schedule shows the family owned 43 enslaved people. James felt the familiar weight that came with reading such documents, each number representing a human life, a stolen identity, generations of trauma. Do we have names? The slave schedules only list ages and gender, not name. But look at this. Patricia pulled out another document. This is the 1870 census, the first one after emancipation. William Whitmore is still at Oakwood, but now he has employees instead of enslaved people. And here she pointed to a line. Marcus Freeman, age 16, laborer Freeman. Marcus had taken a surname after emancipation, claiming his freedom through his name. But he had remained at Oakwood, working for the family that had once owned him. James searched through the court records and found what he was looking for. Labor contracts filed with Henry County between 1866 and 1885. He pulled out the file for 1866 and began reading. The contracts were supposedly voluntary agreements between freedmen and their former owners, establishing terms of employment after slavery ended. But as James read through them, he saw how easily such contracts could become tools of continued bondage. The terms were exploitative. Workers agreed to year-long contracts with minimal wages, often paid in script that could only be used at the plantation store. If they left before the contract ended, they could be arrested for breach of contract and forced to return. Any debts to the employer for housing, food, clothing were deducted from wages, ensuring workers remained perpetually indebted. He found Marcus's contract dated January 1866. Marcus Freeman, approximately 14 years old, agreed to work for William Whitmore for 1 year in exchange for room, board, and $5 per month. The contract stated that Marcus owed William Whitmore $20 for care and sustenance provided during the transition from slavery to freedom. At $5 per month, it would take Marcus 4 months just to pay off that manufactured debt. James flipped through the years. 1867, another contract, similar terms. 1868, same. 1869, 1870, 1871, year after year. Marcus Freeman signed contracts binding him to the Whitmore plantation, or perhaps signed wasn't accurate. Many of the contracts bore only an X next to Marcus's name, suggesting he couldn't write, or had been prevented from learning. This is pennage, Patricia said quietly, reading over his shoulder. Legal slavery under a different name. James nodded grimly. Pennage, the practice of binding workers through debt, had been officially outlawed by Congress in 1867, but the law was rarely enforced in the South. Thousands of black workers remained trapped in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, bound by contracts, debt, and the threat of violence. But the contracts stopped in 1885. After that year, James found no record of Marcus Freeman signing any labor agreement with William Whitmore. Had Marcus finally escaped or had something else happen? He pulled out newspaper archives from the Richmond Dispatch, searching for any mention of the Whitmore family or Oakwood Plantation. Patricia searched the Henrio County court records for any legal proceedings involving the family. It was Patricia who found the first clue. James, look at this. It's a civil case filed in September 1889. William Whitmore versus Thomas Whitmore, a property dispute. James moved to her side. The case file was thin, just a few pages, but the header indicated it had been filed on September 10, 1889, 4 days before the photograph was taken. The complaint was written in the formal legal language of the period, but its meaning was clear. William Whitmore was accusing his son Thomas of attempting to steal property that rightfully belonged to the family estate. The specific property wasn't detailed in the filing, only described as human chat unlawfully retained. A human chat? James said softly. In 1889, 24 years after the 13th Amendment, Patricia pointed to another line. And look at this. Thomas filed a counterclaim the same day. He accused his father of maintaining illegal pennage contracts and claimed he had evidence of fraud and coercion. James felt pieces clicking into place. Thomas Whitmore had discovered what his father was doing. He had found evidence that Marcus Freeman and possibly others were being held in illegal bondage through fraudulent contracts and debt manipulation. And Thomas had decided to act, to testify against his own father. That would explain the inscription on the photograph. May God forgive us for what we have done. Thomas had betrayed his father. He had chosen his friend over his family, justice over loyalty. But what had happened next? The case file showed the initial complaint and counterclaim, but nothing more. No trial date, no resolution, no verdict. James searched the newspaper archives for September and October 1889, looking for any mention of the Whitmore case. He found nothing. No trial announcements, no reports of testimony, no scandal. For a prominent family like the Whitesores, the absence of coverage was suspicious. Then Patricia found something in the November 1889 papers. A brief obituary tucked on an inside page. Thomas William Whitmore, aged 23, died suddenly on October 2, 1889, at his family home in Henrio County. He has survived by his father, William Whitmore, and mother, Elizabeth Whitmore. Services will be private. The family requests snow visitors. James read it twice. Thomas had died less than 3 weeks after the photograph was taken, less than a month after filing his counterclaim against his father. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. We need to find out how he died, James said, and we need to find out what happened to Marcus. James and Patricia requested death certificates for Henrio County from October 1889. The clerk brought them a ledger book, its pages brittle and yellowed. James found Thomas Whitmore's entry dated October 2, 1889. The cause of death was listed as accidental shooting. The attending physician was Dr. Samuel Harrison. The informant who reported the death was William Whitmore, father of the deceased. Accidental shooting, Patricia said skeptically. 3 weeks after he accused his father of illegal peonage, James photographed the page. We need to find the coroner's report, if there was one, and any newspaper coverage of the death. They returned to the newspaper archives, this time searching specifically for Thomas Whitmore's death. In the October 4, 1889 edition of the Richmond Dispatch, they found a longer article. Tragedy at Oakwood Plantation. Young Thomas Whitmore, son of respected planter William Whitmore, died Tuesday evening in what authorities are calling an unfortunate hunting accident. According to Sheriff Martin Crawford, young Whitmore was cleaning a rifle when it discharged, striking him in the chest. He died within minutes. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the family physician, confirmed the death as accidental. The family is said to be devastated by the loss of their only son. The article continued with praise for the Whitmore family's standing in the community, William's service on various boards, and expressions of sympathy from neighbors. There was no mention of the pending legal case between father and son. "This is a cover-up," Patricia said flatly. "A prominent family loses their son in a hunting accident just as he's about to expose his father in court. The sheriff calls it accidental before any investigation. The family physician signs off on it, and somehow the newspapers never mention the legal dispute." James agreed, but proving it more than a century later would be difficult. They needed to find people who had witnessed what happened, servants, workers, neighbors who might have written letters or kept diaries. And they needed to find Marcus Freeman. He had been at the center of Thomas's accusations. He must have known the truth about what happened at Oakwood. If Marcus had survived, if he had left any record, it might hold the answers they needed. James searched for Marcus Freeman in records after 1889. The 1890 census was destroyed, but the 1900 census might show where Marcus had ended up. He pulled up the digital archives and began searching Virginia, then expanding to neighboring states. He found nothing. No Marcus Freeman of the right age anywhere in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, or West Virginia in the 1900 census. It was as if Marcus had vanished after that photograph was taken. Could he have died too? Patricia asked. Maybe William Whitmore killed both of them. Or maybe Marcus escaped, James said. If Thomas was trying to free him, maybe he succeeded before he died. Maybe Marcus ran and changed his name to avoid being tracked. Patricia pulled out her phone. "I'm going to contact the African American Genealogy Network. They specialize in tracing families through the post-emancipation period when records get spotty. If Marcus survived and had descendants, they might be able to find them." While Patricia made calls, James continued searching through Henrio County records. He found property transfers for Oakwood Plantation. William Whitmore had sold portions of the land in 1891 and 1893, suggesting possible financial difficulties. He found tax records, business licenses, and mundane legal filings, but nothing about the case between father and son. Nothing about what had really happened in September and October of 1889. Then he found something unexpected. A probate record from 1912. William Whitmore had died at age 78, and his estate was being settled. The probate included an inventory of property, debts, and assets. Among the debts listed was a curious entry. Outstanding legal settlement, Freeman matter, $500. James stared at the entry. 23 years after Thomas's death, William Whitmore's estate still acknowledged an unresolved legal matter involving someone named Freeman. $500 in 1912 was a substantial sum, roughly equivalent to $15,000 in 2024. What was this settlement for? He searched for any related documents, but found nothing. The Freeman matter remained unexplained, a cryptic reference in an old man's probate file. Patricia returned with news. "I spoke with Dr. Raymond Cole at the Frere Edmunds Bureau Project. He's going to search their database for any Marcus Freeman who might have relocated after 1889. They have records from black churches, mutual aid societies, and Frere Edmunds schools that sometimes fill in gaps when census data is missing." James showed her the probate entry. "Look at this. William Whitmore owed money related to a Freeman matter when he died in 1912. A settlement," Patricia said thoughtfully. "Maybe Thomas did free Marcus before he died. Maybe William had to pay Marcus as part of settling the legal case. Pay him back wages, compensate him for years of illegal pennage. But why would that still be outstanding in 1912? Maybe Marcus was never found to receive the payment. Or maybe William fought it in court for years, and it wasn't resolved until after his death." James felt they were circling something important, a truth buried under layers of legal maneuvering and family secrets. The photograph showed Thomas and Marcus together, two young men whose lives had been intertwined since childhood. Thomas had tried to free his friend from his own father's exploitation, but something had gone terribly wrong. They needed to find Marcus Freeman's story, where he had gone after 1889, whether he had ever received justice, whether he had survived to tell his version of what happened at Oakwood Plantation. 3 days later, Dr. Raymond Cole called James with the first break in Marcus Freeman's trail. "I found him," Raymond said, excitement evident in his voice. "Or at least I found someone who matches the profile." In 1891, a man named Marcus Freeman joined the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. The membership roll lists him as 24 years old, originally from Virginia, employed as a carpenter. Philadelphia, James repeated, already pulling up his laptop. That's a long way from Richmond. That's what makes me think it's him, Raymond said. A lot of freed men headed north to escape the South, especially if they were running from dangerous situations. Philadelphia had a strong black community, good employment opportunities, and most importantly, it was far enough from Virginia that a former enslaved person could start fresh. Raymond sent James digital copies of the church records. The entry for Marcus Freeman was brief, admitted to membership on April 12, 1891, by profession of faith. The handwriting was neat, the record routine, but it meant Marcus had survived whatever happened at Oakwood. He had escaped, traveled hundreds of miles north, and begun rebuilding his life. James searched Philadelphia city directories from the 1890s. In the 1892 directory, he found Marcus Freeman listed as a carpenter, residing at 712 South Street in the heart of Philadelphia's black neighborhood. By 1895, the same Marcus Freeman was listed as owning a small carpentry business on Lombard Street. He made it, James said to Patricia when he called her with the news. Marcus got out and built a life for himself.